Shalom from Jerusalem. Parsha Shavua, Emor, teaches us the laws of the Kahuna, the Kohanim, the priestly family, who actually did the work in the Beis Hamikdash. Now, out of all the tribes of Israel, the Kohanim were chosen by God to do the actual sacrificial work in the house of the living God of Israel, the Beis Hamikdash, which stood in Yerushalayim. For this, they needed separation. Separation from Tumah, separation from anything impure, in order for them to stay on track. And so we find in this week's Parsha quite a few limitations for the Kohanim, exactly who they could marry. For instance, the high priest could only marry someone who's a virgin. And the other priests, well, they had to stay, they could not marry someone who was a divorcee, etc., etc. We find that if a Kohen had some type of some type of deformation, he had to first get healed before he could return to do work in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple service. And of course, the Kohanim, the priests, were not allowed by Torah law to come in contact with a dead corpse. They couldn't go to a friend's funeral. They always had to stay away from any type, which is a custom which goes on to this very day. Now it's interesting to note that in this week's Parsha, we are told of the regular Kohen, who is allowed to have a few exceptions. For instance, his parents, his siblings, he would be allowed to go and accompany them on the last journey into the cemetery. The high priest, though, on the other hand, could never leave for that purpose the Beis Hamikdash. He could never become Tameh. The only way that a high priest could become Tameh if he came in contact with what we call a met mitzvah, a corpse which he found on the way and there was no one else to do the burial for. He would be permitted in that case, and this is the only case, to actually take part of the burial himself. So we see from this that the Kohanim, the Torah has instructed them to live a life of Kedusha, of holiness. In fact, we find in excavations in the Jewish quarter, the Herodian quarter, which was dug out underneath the today modern day Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, you actually find where the Kohanim lived. And this was not just something which was written down in the Torah, but this is the actual way of life, because we find in the excavations over there, we find kalim, we find vessels which were made out of stone. Stone does not transparent the tumah, the impurities. And so this was something that you would be able to find in every Kohen's house as a symbol of what the Kohanim used to use. For instance, if you take a cereal bowl to have some Captain Crunch, you wouldn't use a plastic bowl in the house of the Kohanim or an earthenware vessel. No, you would not. It would be a bowl made out of stone. And this way the impurities wouldn't transfer over to them or into their vessels themselves. So we see that they were held, so to speak, a cut above the rest in their holiness and their separation. And this is all due and fine and well. But we also find something very interesting. The Torah also, on the other hand, and of all the commandments which were given over to the Jewish people, which we know is 613 commandments, we find that the nature of all of these commandments is not a dangerous situation for a person to fulfill that particular commandment. For instance, if a person keeps Shabbat, it doesn't endanger that particular person himself. None of the commandments actually endanger anybody when they go out to fulfill God's word. If a person is obligated to put tefillin on, or to wear tzitzit, or whatever else he is obligated to do, this particular commandment does not, of course, endanger the person to do that, except for one mitzvah in the Torah. And that is the mitzvah of what we call milchemet mitzvah, the obligation to go out to war. Now, even though war is a dangerous thing, and people do die in war, soldiers do fall, unfortunately, there is still a commandment on part of the Torah to go out and to fulfill the war part. Now, this is an interesting question over here. If we are commanded on one hand to go out and to fight the battles in the Milchemet Mitzvah, how could a Kohen partake of the war front if, on the other hand, he would come in contact, obviously in war, people will be killed, he'll come in contact with dead corpse, which is something which he's forbidden to come in contact with. So on one hand, the Torah obligates us to go out to fight Milchemet Mitzvah, to go out and to fight the just wars, which we fight today in Eretz Yisrael. On the other hand, the Kohen, as the Kohen family, as this week's Parsha points out so beautifully, this person has to be separated. He cannot come in contact with any dead corpse. In fact, it's forbidden for him according to Torah law, except for the exceptions which we wrote down for the regular Kohen. And in the case of the high priest, there's no exceptions whatsoever. So how is it possible for this Kohen to go out to war? Did the Kohen go out to war? Maybe he was exempt. Maybe he sat aside while the other people went out to war. But we find that the Talmud teaches us that in the time of Milchemet Mitzvah, the time of the war that is an obligation upon everybody, even a Chatan and Kala go out, the bride and the groom, go out from the canopy, and they go out to do battle, each one in its particular field. The Chatan, the bride, goes out, the groom, goes out to do the battles. And the bride also does her work, as is brought down by the rabbis. She helps out in the war front, whatever could be done, providing food, providing water, fixing the roads for them, etc. So everyone has their part. So in this particular piece of the Talmud, it doesn't say that the Kohen doesn't go out to battle, but how could he go out to battle if it's forbidden for him, on one hand, to become Tameh? So the answer is that we find a wonderful example in the time of King Solomon. King Solomon, which we know, kingdom lasted for over 40 years. His Tsar Tzava, his chief of staff, was none other than Benayahu ben Yehoyada ben Ishchai. Benayahu was his chief of staff. He was the head general in the time of Shlomo Melech. In fact, we find at the beginning of the book of Shmuel, where Shlomo Melech had just become king, and he sends Benayahu out to kill Yoav. Yoav is the past general, and he had revolted against King David, and now his time has come because he revolted against the kingdom of David. He had to be put to death, and Benayahu comes and catches up to him in Jerusalem, in the Beis Hamikdash, and puts him to death. Well, how could Benayahu does that? Because we know that Benayahu ben Yehoyada was a Kohen. So if he was a Kohen, how is he able, first of all, to be the leader of the army in the time of Shlomo? How is he able to go and partake of this battle and to kill Yoav, where he became ritually impure? We find from this that when it comes to a Milchemet Mitzvah, it's doche, it pushes off the lotaseh, the transgression of a Kohen becoming Tameh. So important is Milchemet Mitzvah that it pushes off the obligation for the Kohen not to become Tameh in the time of battle. So we see that there is no exemption for the Kohanim, for them not to go out to battle. For we find that Benayahu, and earlier we find Pinchas. Pinchas was the Kohen Gadol, but yet he led the troops out to revenge the wars against Midian. So we find from this that when it comes to an obligated war, when it comes to a mitzvah, when it comes to the commandment of war, there is no such thing as a person saying, well, I'm tahor, I'm ritually pure, I can't go out to battle because I may come in contact with a corpse. Everybody goes, as the Talmud teaches us, chatan v'kala, the bride and the groom also removed. And we see here from this example that also the Kohanim would go out to do battle when they had to, because this is a Milchemet Mitzvah. When it's a Milchemet Mitzvah, just like it is today, nobody sits around. Everyone has their obligation to partake of this particular commandment. That's what we learned today from this lesson in our week's parsha. I'm Levi Chazan, and I'm coming to you from somewhere in Jerusalem. And until next time.